So, I've been debating whether to post this for a while. It's been 3 years since it happened, but I guess I'm still processing all of it. IDK. But now that my revenge plan is actually working, I kinda need to tell someone because holy shit. Some background. I've always been the black sheep in my family. Growing up, nothing I did was ever good enough. My older sister Sharon, 31, was the golden child who got straight A's and went to an Ivy League school. My younger brother, Trevor, 24, was the athletic star who got a full ride for baseball. And then there was me, the middle child who liked taking pictures and wasting time on artsy crap, as my dad called it. I tried college for 2 years but dropped out to pursue photography. My parents lost their minds. Dad told me I was throwing my life away. Mom cried for weeks. I moved into a crappy apartment with a roommate and started building my portfolio. Things were tough, but I was making progress, even had some of my work featured in local exhibitions. Not that my family noticed or cared. So last year, when my mom texted me about a family vacation to Hawaii, I was honestly shocked. They hadn't invited me on a trip in literally 5 years, not since that disaster in Florida where Dad spent the whole time criticizing my lack of direction. But Mom was insistent, sent me all the details, flight info, resort name, even what to pack, said it was going to be a fresh start for all of us. I was suspicious at first, like why now? But then I thought maybe they were finally accepting me or something. I spent like 2 weeks getting ready, bought new swimwear, got some decent sunscreen, even spent $200 I couldn't really afford on a nice camera bag for the trip. Had to call in favors to reschedule 3 photo shoots I had booked. My roommate even drove me to the airport because my car was in the shop. The morning of the flight, we all met at my parents' house. It was awkward, but not terrible. Mom seemed weirdly excited, kept checking if I had packed everything. Dad barely spoke to me, which was normal. Sharon was on her phone the whole time, and Trevor kept smirking at me for some reason. But whatever. I figured it was just our usual family tension. We drove 3 hours to the airport in Dad's Lexus SUV. I tried making conversation, but everyone kept giving each other these looks. I figured they were just being their usual judgmental selves. We checked in, got through security, and headed to gate B7. I was actually starting to get excited, thinking maybe this trip could help us reconnect or something. Then we got to the gate and everything changed. When the gate agent called for boarding passes, my family all pulled theirs out. I reached for mine in my backpack, and that's when my dad started laughing. Not like a normal laugh, this weird, cruel laugh I'd never heard before. He turned to me and said, "Wait, you actually thought we were bringing you?" I thought he was joking at first, but then everyone started laughing, like howling with laughter. My mom was literally wiping tears from her eyes saying, "We only told you about Hawaii to see if you'd actually show up. Look at this pathetic loser with his little suitcase. Did you tell your imaginary friends you were going on vacation?" My sister had her phone out, recording the whole thing for her Instagram, where she has like 3K followers. She was narrating the whole thing. LMAO. He actually came to the airport. This family failure thought he was going to Hawaii. Trevor couldn't stop laughing, telling me, "Bro, you packed your swim trunks. You told people at work about the trip. You're 27 and you still fall for everything. Even kids can see you're a walking L." People around us were staring. Some looked uncomfortable, others were pretending not to notice. I just stood there, my face burning, unable to process what was happening. Then my dad got serious, looked me right in the eyes and said, "Look at yourself. 27, living in that roach-infested dump. You're not our son. You're our biggest regret." Then he threw a crumpled $20 bill at my feet. "For gas," he said. "And here's some truth. We changed the locks. Don't come home for holidays. You're nothing to us." As they walked toward first-class boarding, something in me just snapped. All those years of taking their shit, trying to earn their approval? For what? I shouted after them that they would regret this. "Remember my words. You'll all regret this." My dad just smirked and said, "The only thing we regret is that our last name is on your birth certificate." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just smiled, picked up that pathetic 20, and walked out of that airport with a clarity I'd never felt before. I blocked all their numbers, deleted them from social media, and never went back to their house. My roommate was shocked when I told him what happened, offered to let me stay in our place longer until I figured things out. That night, I sat on our balcony and made a promise to myself. This wasn't over. They thought I was nothing, a failure, a joke. I was going to prove them wrong in ways they couldn't even imagine. It took 3 years of hard work, smart decisions, and patience. But 2 days ago, my plan finally paid off. My phone literally exploded with notifications. 70 missed calls, 45 text messages, all from them. Every single one of them. They don't know it yet, but I'm the reason their perfect little world is crumbling around them. And I'm just getting started. Update 1. Holy shit, I did not expect my last post to blow up like that. Thanks for all the support, seriously. So many of you asked for an update, so here's what's been happening since that day at the airport. The first week after the prank was rough AF. I got back to my apartment and just sat on my bed staring at the wall for like hours. My roommate Dustin was great though. He ordered pizza, didn't ask too many questions, just let me process. The next morning I woke up to 3 voicemails from my mom acting like nothing happened, asking if I could help my dad with some computer thing. I deleted them without listening all the way through and blocked her number. Living situation got complicated fast. Our lease was ending in 2 weeks, and Dustin was moving in with his girlfriend. I couldn't afford the place on my own, and finding a new roommate that quick wasn't happening. Plus, my car was still in the shop, transmission issues because of course, and I was basically living on ramen and whatever shoots I could book last minute. I posted on a photography Facebook group looking for gigs, and this guy Grant responded saying he needed someone to take pictures of some properties for his website. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was something. We met at this coffee shop downtown, and he seemed decent enough, though kinda intense about the specific angles he wanted. Whatever. Money is money. After the shoot, Grant asked if I wanted to grab a beer. I wasn't really in the mood to socialize, but I also didn't want to go back to my empty apartment, so I said, sure. That's when things got interesting. Grant started telling me about his work in real estate development. At first I was just nodding along, but then he mentioned a name I recognized. Heathcliff Properties. That's my dad's company. I almost choked on my beer. I played it cool, asked some casual questions. Grant had no idea about my connection. Why would he? He just kept talking about how Heathcliff was trying to develop this old warehouse district, but running into problems with financing and permits. He mentioned that my dad, though he just called him the owner, was known for cutting corners and pissing off investors. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My whole life, my dad talked about his business like it was this incredible success story. He always made it sound like he was some real estate genius who built an empire from nothing. That's why he thought my photography was such a joke, because it wasn't real business. Over the next few weeks, I did more shoots for Grant. Each time, I learned a little more about the real estate world. Grant introduced me to some of his investor friends who needed photos of their properties. One of them, Barbara, really liked my work and hired me to document a renovation project from start to finish. The housing situation was still a problem, though. My time was running out, and I had nowhere to go. I definitely wasn't crawling back to my parents, and most of my friends had tiny places or lived with partners. I was literally looking at storage units online, wondering if I could secretly live in one. Spoiler, you can't. When Barbara offered me her garage apartment for cheap while I worked on her project. It wasn't fancy, just a converted space above a detached garage, but it had a bathroom and a kitchenette. I moved in the next day. That's when things really started changing. Living at Barbara's place put me in this whole new world. She would have these dinner parties with real estate people, investors, developers. I'd get invited sometimes, especially when they needed photos of the renovations. These people talked about property like it was a game. Who was buying what? Which neighborhoods were up and coming? How to spot a building with good bones. I started learning about it all. Zoning laws, property taxes, financing. All that boring shit I used to zone out when my dad talked about. But now, I was actually interested. Not just because I wanted revenge, but because I was starting to see opportunities. During one of those dinners, someone mentioned that my dad's company was struggling hard. Apparently, he'd over-leveraged on some big development and investors were pulling out. Barbara asked if I was okay. I must have looked shocked or something. I played it off, said I was just tired. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd learned. My dad, the successful businessman who spent my entire life making me feel like shit for not following in his footsteps, was failing at his own game. The irony was almost too perfect. I spent the next few weeks digging deeper. Started Googling my dad's company, reading business news, property records, anything I could find online. Found out he had 3 failed developments in the last 5 years. The company was staying afloat on reputation alone. One day, while shooting a property, I noticed something the owner had missed. Water damage that was going to be a major problem down the line. I pointed it out, and the guy was super grateful, saved him thousands in future repairs. He gave me a bonus and asked if I ever thought about getting into property inspection or consulting. I laughed it off, but it got me thinking. My eye for detail in photography translated pretty well to spotting issues with properties. I started looking more carefully at the places I shot, making notes about potential problems or improvements. The clients loved it, started paying me extra for my insights. Around month 2, Barbara introduced me to Elizabeth, this badass property investor who flipped houses for a living. She hired me to document one of her flips from start to finish. While working with her, I mentioned a small house I'd photographed in an overlooked neighborhood that I thought had potential. She actually went and looked at it, ended up buying it based partly on my recommendation. When she flipped it 3 months later, she made a $60,000 profit and gave me a $5,000 finder's fee. $5,000. More money than I'd ever had at once in my life. That's when it clicked. I didn't need to be a photographer who sometimes gave real estate advice. I could be a property scout who happened to take great photos. I invested that money in a real estate course and started studying the market seriously. Started a business Instagram where I posted my property photos along with brief analyses. Got more clients. Started building connections. All while keeping tabs on my dad's company from a distance. Then last week, I hit the jackpot. Elizabeth invited me to this industry event. I almost didn't go because I was worried my dad might be there, but she said it was mostly for the younger crowd in real estate. I put on the one decent outfit I owned and went. There was this guy there, older than most of us, looking kind of out of place. He was talking to anyone who would listen about needing new investors for a sure thing development. Most people were avoiding him, but I was curious. I grabbed a drink and casually joined the conversation. It was my dad's business partner, Robert. He had no idea who I was. We'd only met a couple times when I was younger, and I've grown a beard since then. He was desperate for new investors because my dad had apparently made some terrible decisions that tanked their latest project. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. I asked some questions, sounding interested but non-committal. Robert gave me his card, practically begged me to call him if I knew anyone with capital to invest. I smiled and said I might know some people. That night, I called Elizabeth and told her I had an investment opportunity. I didn't mention my connection, just laid out what I knew about the company, its assets, and its current vulnerable position. She was intrigued but cautious, asked for more details. For the next week, I gathered every piece of information I could about my dad's company. Public records, news articles, property listings. I put together a detailed analysis of its weaknesses and potential value. Elizabeth was impressed. She said she wanted to bring in some of her investor friends to look at a possible takeover. Yesterday, we had a meeting. 5 serious investors looking at my presentation about why this failing company was actually a good buy. They asked tough questions, but I was prepared. By the end, they were interested. Really interested. Elizabeth said they were forming an investment group and wanted me involved as a consultant. And then this morning, my phone blew up. All those missed calls and messages from my family. Turns out Robert had mentioned to my dad that some young hotshot was putting together an investor group looking at their company. Dad must have done some digging and figured out it was me. The messages range from furious, my dad, to panicky, my mom, to suddenly friendly, my sister. My brother sent a voice message that was just him shouting incoherently. I haven't responded to any of them. I'm sitting in a coffee shop right now, still trying to process all of this. 3 months ago, I was the family disappointment being humiliated at an airport. Now I'm part of a group that might buy my dad's failing company out from under him. This isn't even the revenge I planned. This is just the beginning. Update 2. I didn't expect so many people to care about my situation. Some of you called BS on my story, which is fine, TBH. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it. Anyway, a lot has happened since my last update, so grab a drink or whatever because this is going to be a long one. After that first meeting with Elizabeth and her investor friends, things moved pretty slowly for a while. Like, painfully slow. I was all fired up to take down my dad's company immediately, but turns out business acquisitions don't happen overnight. Shocker, I know. Elizabeth kept reminding me that patience was key, and we needed to be strategic. I ignored all my family's messages and calls for weeks. Eventually, they stopped trying, except my mom, who would still text once a month with some random thinking of you BS. I never responded. Instead, I focused on building my reputation in the real estate world. Started my own little consulting business where I'd help investors identify promising properties and potential issues. Nothing fancy, just me and my camera and an eye for details most people miss. By the end of the first year, I was actually making decent money, enough to move out of Barbara's garage apartment and rent my own place. During this time, Elizabeth introduced me to her lawyer friend, Heather. We met for coffee to discuss the potential acquisition of my dad's company. I was nervous about telling her my personal connection, but Elizabeth had already filled her in. When I walked in, Heather already had a folder of notes on the table. She didn't waste time with small talk, just looked at me, and asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with this. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. She nodded and said we needed to be careful about how we approached this. Not just legally, but ethically. She wanted to make sure my motivation wasn't going to cloud my judgment or lead to decisions that might come back to bite us. That conversation really stuck with me. Was I doing this just for revenge, Or was there actually a good business opportunity here? I spent a few days thinking about it and realized it could be both. My dad's company had valuable assets and connections. It was just being run into the ground by his ego and bad decisions. Around this time, I started dating this girl I met at a coffee shop. After a few weeks, she asked about my family. I usually avoided the topic, but for some reason I told her everything. She was the first person outside the real estate circle who knew the whole story. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked me if ruining my dad's company would actually make me feel better. I got defensive, and we had our first big fight. I told her she didn't understand what it felt like to be humiliated like that, to be told you're nothing by your own family. She grabbed her coat and left. We didn't speak for a week, and when she finally called, she said she couldn't be with someone whose whole life was centered around revenge. We broke up that night. That breakup hit me harder than I expected, made me question what I was doing with my life. But then I got a text from my sister Sharon out of the blue. It wasn't an apology or anything. She was asking if I could photograph her wedding. Like, are you kidding me? After what she did at the airport, live streaming my humiliation, I blocked her number immediately. That text reminded me exactly why I was doing this. My family never saw me as a person with feelings. I was just a tool they could use when convenient. Well, now I was going to show them exactly who I'd become. I called Elizabeth and told her I was ready to move forward. She had been monitoring my dad's company, and things had gotten even worse for them. They'd lost 2 major investors and a project had fallen through. The timing was perfect. We set up a meeting with the investor group, 7 people around a conference table, going over financial reports and property assessments. I presented a detailed strategy for how we could acquire Heathcliff properties through a series of calculated moves. The plan wasn't to buy them outright. That would alert my dad too early. Instead, we would acquire their debt from banks, buy out smaller investors, and basically surround them until they had no choice but to sell. One of the investors, an older guy named Ross, weird coincidence having the same name, questioned whether I was too emotionally involved. I admitted I was, but argued that my personal knowledge of the company and its owner gave us an edge. I knew how my dad thought, what moves he would make when backed into a corner. After some debate, they agreed to move forward with my plan. Over the next 6 months, we executed each step carefully. I stayed in the background while Elizabeth and the others made the moves. We bought debt, acquired connected properties, and slowly tightened the noose. My dad started getting desperate. I could tell from the increasingly panicked LinkedIn posts Robert was making about seeking new partnerships. Then we hit a roadblock. My dad somehow convinced a major investor to bail them out. We hadn't accounted for that. The group was frustrated and some wanted to back out. That night I couldn't sleep. I was so close to making my family pay and now it might all fall apart. I spent the weekend digging through everything I could find about this new investor. Social media, business records, newspaper articles, and that's when I found it. This guy had worked with my dad before, on a project that had mysteriously fallen through. There were rumors of permit issues and cutting corners, but nothing concrete. I took a risk and reached out to a city planning official I'd met through Barbara, asked some casual questions about that old project. He was hesitant at first, but eventually mentioned there had been serious safety violations that got buried somehow. He couldn't say more, but suggested I look into public records from that time. I spent days at the county clerk's office going through dusty files. What I found was gold. Documentation showing my dad had knowingly built on contaminated land and falsified environmental reports. The project was only shut down because a whistleblower came forward, but somehow my dad avoided any personal consequences. I brought this information to our investor group. We didn't use it for blackmail or anything illegal. We simply made it known to the new investor that we were aware of the previous project's issues. He pulled out within a week. With no bailout in sight, my dad's company was on its last legs. That's when we made our move, a formal offer to buy Heathcliff properties. The offer came through a holding company, so my name wasn't anywhere on the paperwork. The terms were fair, but firm. They could accept or face bankruptcy. After 2 weeks of negotiations, they accepted. I wasn't in the room when the papers were signed, but Elizabeth texted me a picture of my dad signing away his company. I stared at that photo for hours, feeling, honestly, not as satisfied as I expected. Like I'd won, but it felt hollow somehow. That changed the next day when I was going through the company files Elizabeth had brought over. In a folder labeled Family Trust, I found documents that finally explained why my family had always treated me like shit. Turns out my dad wasn't my biological father. My mom had had an affair with his former business partner, the same guy who had taught me photography when I was a kid, the one person who had ever encouraged my creative side. He died when I was 14, and I'd always wondered why my family had forbidden me from attending his funeral. The documents showed that my biological father had left me a significant trust fund that would activate when I turned 30. My dad had been managing this money and, from the records, mismanaging it and using it to fund his failing projects. That's why they wanted me gone before I discovered the truth. That's why they hated my interest in photography. It reminded them of him. I was still processing this bombshell when my phone exploded with notifications. 70 missed calls, 45 text messages, emails, Facebook messages, all from my family members. They'd finally discovered who was behind the acquisition. The last message from my dad just said, "We need to talk, now." I haven't responded yet, but I've scheduled a board meeting for tomorrow morning. And guess who's been summoned to attend? Final update. I barely slept the night before the board meeting, kept checking my phone, watching the texts and calls pile up. My dad went from threatening to begging to offering money. The whole emotional manipulation playbook. My mom sent these long guilt trip messages about family and forgiveness. Sharon kept sending voice messages I deleted without listening. Trevor just sent "Dude, WTF" about 50 times. I got to the office building an hour early. Wanted to be there first, sitting at the head of the table when they arrived. Elizabeth thought this was petty, but also admitted it was kinda genius. The conference room I chose wasn't the main one. It was smaller. And more importantly, it was in the same hotel chain where they'd humiliated me 3 years ago. Not the exact same location, but same branding, same layout. A little detail they probably wouldn't notice, but it mattered to me. Heather arrived 40 minutes early with a stack of folders. She's been my rock through this whole process. Totally professional, but also gets the emotional side of it. She ran through what we could legally say and do in this meeting. I wasn't planning to break any laws, but it felt good having her there to keep me in check. Elizabeth showed up next with coffee for everyone. She sat across from where my family would be sitting, my backup if things got heated. The other investors decided to skip this meeting. They trusted me to handle it, which honestly meant a lot. At exactly 10 o'clock, they walked in. Dad first, then Mom, then Sharon and Trevor. They'd dressed up like it was a regular business meeting, suits, dress, the whole thing. Dad had that fake, confident walk he always used when he was actually nervous. When he saw me sitting at the head of the table, he stopped cold. He hadn't actually believed it was me until that moment, I could tell. Mom gasped. Sharon grabbed Trevor's arm. For a few seconds, nobody moved or said anything. I broke the silence by welcoming them to the meeting and asking them to sit down. Tried to keep my voice steady but firm. Dad looked like he wanted to say something, probably yell, but Mom tugged his sleeve and they all sat down. I introduced Elizabeth as my business partner and Heather as legal counsel. Dad immediately started talking over me, demanding to know what kind of game I was playing. Said I had no right to steal his company, that I didn't know the first thing about real estate, that this was all some pathetic attempt to get back at him. I let him rant for about a minute, then held up my hand. Told him that technically it wasn't his company anymore. The papers were signed, ownership had transferred, and we were now having a courtesy meeting to discuss transition plans. He turned red and slammed his fist on the table. Mom tried a different approach. Started crying, asking what had happened to her sweet boy, saying she'd always supported my little hobby and couldn't understand why I would do something so cruel to my own family. Sharon chimed in, saying I was being dramatic about one little joke at the airport. That's when I opened the folder Heather had prepared. Inside was a printout of the trust fund documents, which I slid across the table. Asked them if they wanted to explain this before we continued. The look on their faces, I wish I could have taken a picture. Dad went pale. Mom stopped crying instantly. Sharon and Trevor looked confused, then shocked as they realized what they were looking at. Dad recovered first, claiming the documents were fake or that I didn't understand what I was looking at. That's when Heather stepped in, explaining in very clear legal terms that we had verified the trust's existence and validity. She also mentioned that using trust fund money for personal business ventures without the beneficiary's knowledge or consent constituted financial fraud. Trevor asked what the hell was going on. He genuinely seemed in the dark. I explained that I wasn't actually Dad's biological son, that my real father was his former business partner, and that he'd left me a trust fund that Dad had been illegally using to prop up his failing business ventures for years. Trevor looked at our parents with this confused, betrayed expression. Sharon started typing frantically on her phone. Mom just stared at her hands, not denying anything. Dad tried one last angle, said that everything he did was for the family, that he'd invested the trust money to grow it for me, that he was going to tell me when the time was right. Said I should be grateful he raised me even knowing I wasn't his. I laughed. Actually laughed right in his face, told him that if that was true, he wouldn't have spent my entire life making me feel worthless, wouldn't have humiliated me at an airport and told me I was nothing to him, Wouldn't have spent years trying to crush my interest in photography. The one thing that connected me to my real father. The room got very quiet after that. I could feel Elizabeth watching me, making sure I didn't lose it completely. But I was calm, calmer than I'd been in years, actually. I laid out the options. Option 1, I would report the financial fraud to the authorities, which would likely result in criminal charges. Option 2, they could sign a settlement agreement right now. Heather had it ready, admit what they'd done, and walk away with enough money to start over but not live luxuriously. Dad started arguing, but Mom put her hand on his arm and whispered something. He shut up for once. Trevor asked what would happen to him and Sharon. I told them they weren't responsible for what our parents did, but they had participated in humiliating me. So I wasn't exactly feeling generous toward them either. Sharon finally spoke up, asked if I was planning to ruin their lives over one bad day. I reminded her that she had live-streamed my humiliation to thousands of her followers, asked her how many bad days she'd given me over the years with her constant put-downs and mockery. She didn't have an answer for that. Dad asked for time to consider the options. I said they had until the end of the meeting, about 20 more minutes. He tried to negotiate, but I reminded him that he was no longer in a position of power here. For the first time in my life, I watched him deflate, looking small and old. Mom asked if there was any way to salvage our family relationship. I told her honestly that I didn't know, said I wasn't sure I could ever trust them again after what they'd done, but that how they handled this situation would be a start. Trevor surprised me by apologizing, said he'd been a dick because that's what he thought brothers were supposed to do, and because Dad always made it seem like I deserved it. Said he'd never really understood why everyone treated me so differently. He asked if we could talk privately sometime. I told him maybe, but not right away. Sharon didn't apologize. She just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally shooting me resentful looks. Whatever. When the 20 minutes were up, I asked for their decision. Dad looked at Mom, who nodded slightly. He pushed the settlement agreement toward Heather and asked for a pen. They both signed it without reading it thoroughly, which was stupid but typical. As they were getting up to leave, Dad asked what I planned to do with the company. Told him I was going to rebuild it, fix the problems he'd created, and run it ethically. His lip curled in this dismissive way I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. He said I wouldn't last 6 months. I smiled and told him I'd already lasted 3 years without him or his money. I could handle it. They filed out of the room, but Mom lingered at the door. She asked if she could call me sometime. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Just told her I needed time. She nodded and left. After they were gone, I sat back down and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. Elizabeth high-fived me. Heather started organizing the signed documents. It was over. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been working on restructuring the company. Turns out I'm actually good at this, probably because I approach it differently than my dad did. I focus on the potential in properties, not just the fastest profit. Trevor reached out a few days ago. We met for coffee, which was awkward but not terrible. He's still figuring out his own life now that Dad's safety net is gone. I'm not ready to forgive him, but I don't hate him either.